and Turkey, and it's quite amazing. Then she's going to be talking about some events in a crop circle here in the United States that are shockingly similar to something that happened to me in a similar circle here in this country. So it's very, very unusual and exciting stuff. Then we have an extraordinarily special show for you. Michael Baigent is with us, The Jesus Papers, his new book exposing an incredible cover-up, answering the questions about Christianity that he has been asking ever since Holy Blood, Holy Grail. He and William Henry get into this deeply, and it is really amazing. Then William and Jordan Maxwell, for our subscribers, talk about this and many, many other things. You will get a whole new view and a whole new look at the remarkable life of a remarkable being, Jesus Christ, listening to this show. Next week on Dreamland, Hakim is going to be with us. Hakim is a teacher in the ancient Kemet tradition from ancient Egypt. His family has kept the teachings of the ancient Egyptian priesthood intact all of these years, and he's got some extraordinary things to say. He's the teacher of William Henry. He's the teacher of Stephen Mailer. He is a truly remarkable man, so get set for some real wonder in your life next week on Dreamland. And isn't that what we're really all about here, is looking up and seeing the wonder all around us. Before we go on, I'd like to let you subscribers know that in August you will be getting a signed bookplate in the mail for the Greys, a special Greys bookplate personally signed by me. You do not need to buy a copy. You'll get it simply because you are a subscriber. So if you reserve a copy at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or your local bookstore, you buy a copy of the Greys, know that you will get a signature. The reason I'm doing this is I'm not doing a very extensive author tour for the Greys at all because of various conditions. It's extremely difficult to do these days. So I'm going to be sending everyone a signed bookplate instead. And now from earthfiles.com, the best edge science website in the world, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. And one of the surprises is this is not a story about Mount Ararat, Turkey. This is about a mountain in northern Iran that once upon a time biblically was referred to as the Kingdom of Ararat, long before the time of Jesus Christ. The Bible says God was angry at sinful humanity and planned to flood the planet above all the mountaintops to get rid of everyone. But God took pity on a man named Noah and his family and decided to save them and many animals. The salvation, according to the Bible, was a boat made of gopher wood. As the floodwaters receded, Noah's Ark came to rest on, quote, Ararat Mountains, unquote, plural. In Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 27, Ararat is called a kingdom that fights with Babylon, not a volcanic mountain in Turkey. In fact, Mount Ararat, Turkey, was not given that name until around 1200 AD. That means historically there was an ancient Ararat kingdom with many mountains in what most likely would have been Mesopotamia or today's Iran and Iraq. Further, the King James Version of the Bible in chapter 11, verse 2, states that Noah's descendants, quote, journeyed from the east and found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there, unquote. 3 chapters later, in Genesis chapter 14, Shinar is the land ruled by King Amraphel, who reigned in Babylon. Babylon means gate of God and was in the plain of Shinar on the Euphrates River, about 50 miles south of modern-day Baghdad, Iraq. One Noah's Ark researcher named Robert Cornuke had explored Mount Ararat in Turkey with astronaut James Irwin some years ago. Mr. Cornuke was FBI trained and worked as a police investigator and SWAT team member in Orange County, California. He read a lot of history, and as a hard-nosed investigator, he came to the conclusion that Noah's Ark must have stopped on one of the Ararat mountains east of Babylon. He and others interested in finding the Ark's remains and other Bible artifacts formed the Bible Archaeology Search and Exploration Institute, known as BASE, B-A-S-E. In July 2005, a year ago, and this year in June, Mr. Kornuk and his team applied to the Iranian government for tourist visas, which were granted. Without publicity, the BASE team quietly searched a 15,000-foot-high mountain called Suleiman in the Elburz mountain range of northern Iran. There they found a large, dark-colored rock outcrop about 400 feet long that looks quite different than the surrounding mountain. On close inspection, the dark rock has a lot of slabs in it that could be interpreted as fossilized wood planks or beams of a boat. And you can see very good photographs of this most recent expedition at my news website, earthfiles.com. At the top of the headlines page is a hot link to this Noah's Ark report. Now, what convinced Bob Kornuk to search the Iranian mountain?
We were told early on by a man named Ed Davis in 1943, who was an Army sergeant building roads through Iran, that he was taken up to this mountain and shown this object that he was told to be Noah's Ark. So going to this one particular mountain, that's what we were doing, is following the Ed Davis story, this sergeant in World War II. I went to the University of Denver. Ed Davis had provided me with a map to get up to the site. We followed the map. He told me how we could get to this site, the roads to use, and we found the site that Ed Davis said he saw Noah's Ark. It wasn't that impressive when we first walked up to it. We said, well, this is just a big black rock outcropping, very different from anything else for miles and miles and miles. Very distinctive rock outcropping. When we got up close to it, we saw that the rocks resembled beams, a stone that was now looking like wooden beams. It looked like they had been on a ship at one time or some wooden structure. So it was very exciting to see this object up there that was very different than all the other rocks in the whole region.
Could you give me some sizes? The Bible talked in cubits. No one today really understands exactly what a cubit is.
Right. Well, the Bible describes the ark as being 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. Now, a cubit is a fluctuating distance. It was the tip of the finger to the elbow of the ruler at the time. Now, that's where the problem comes in. We don't know how big the ruler was at the time. But a loose interpretation is about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. An enormous ship. So we found this object to be about 400 feet long in the side of a hill. It goes in one side and outside the other. So this object just fits the general description of the Bible.
Is there some scientific method that can now be applied to this rock that could confirm if it was wood originally and when it may have been constructed as wood?
Well, yes and no. We don't even know what gopher wood is. So not knowing what gopher wood was at the time the ark was constructed, we just don't have a method to determine what gopher wood is. At the best, we can look at some of these rocks and slice them open in thin sections and see if we can see any cell structure. When we cut these rocks open, we found a unique sea organism in it, which was in the rock, which can only be found in a deep ocean environment. We also found sea life around this object, which indicated to us that at one time it was under the ocean. We found literally thousands of clams, some of them a 1-inch thick mantle of clams in the area at about 14,000 feet. Now, this object had some cell structure within it, but maybe the whole object is stone, and just a few of the samples down below had some cell structure, which would be residue from petrified wood, maybe from trees that were up there involved. We're still going through the process of trying to determine what are we looking at this object. We've only been back a few weeks, and we're really in the embryonic stages of the research.
And when you say cell structure, you mean something that would be like from a tree or a plant that would be fossilized?
It looks as if some of the object that we brought back, some of the samples that we brought back, have some cell structure in them. Of course, most of the objects up there just look like rock, just common everyday rock. But we took the most tantalizing pieces that might have some cell structure, and we're really pleased that we have found a little, or we're told that we have little.
Robert Kornuk's next goal is to pay for clear, close-up satellite imagery of this dark rock outcropping on Mount Suleiman in the Elburz Mountains. The fact that the unusual long slabs of rock stick out both sides of the mountaintop does not prove it's a fossilized arc. But at least Mr. Cornuke thinks he is finally looking on the right mountain range east of Baghdad in the mountains of northern Iran, not Turkey. Another Earth mystery has been unfolding amid all of the Earth mounds in the southwestern Indiana area. If you find Evansville, Indiana on a map, a little southeast of the city is the Angel Mounds Historic Site, those strange, mysterious, multiple mounds all over the Midwest. And here is one of those areas. Several miles northeast of Angel Mounds in Dubois County is the farming community of Huntingburg. On Sunday, June 25th, wheat farmer David Ring was running his harvester into his last field. Suddenly he realized that there was a big flat circle neatly laid down in his crop. He told me that the plants looked combed down in a swirl. And he said one of his farmhands and he got off the harvester, they walked around and they discovered that there were also odd patterns coming off of the big circle. One looked like a backward F, and the other was a straight line with two short lines coming off of it. And there were also two big loops coming off one side of the circle that looked a bit like their own tractor tram lines. The lines were not perfect. They ranged from being 1.5 to nearly 3 feet wide, but Mr. Ring knew that he and his tractor and harvester had not made those loops. Mr. Ring was puzzled, but he told me, quote, "It was my last field. I'm a farmer, and I wanted to get as much of that wheat into my harvester as I could," unquote. Fortunately, the manager of the local Huntingburg airport flew over the wheat formation before the harvester nearly destroyed it, and he took several good aerial photographs, which you can now see at my news website, www.earthfiles.com. At the top of the headlines page, along with the Noah's Ark report, is a hot link to this Earth Files report about the Huntingburg crop circle. That was Sunday, June 25th. By Thursday, June 29th, Crop Circle investigator Ted Robertson with the Independent Crop Circle Researchers Association got to the field to take measurements and make a diagram. And the next day, Jeffrey Wilson, director of the ICCRA, along with some of his field researchers, gathered at the formation site to gather plant samples and measure the pattern for radiation, and he has now a magnetometer. So far, the apical growth nodes in the collected wheat samples are statistically elongated. That means that some kind of complex energy interacted with those growing plants. Elongated growth nodes have been found in crop formations around the world for the past 15 years and are not an anomaly that can be produced by hoaxers. Also, the radiation in the crop pattern was 2 to 3 times higher than background. The radiation level is not harmful, but it is statistically significant and has been measured in other mysterious crop formations over the years. David Ring, the farm owner, also noticed that when he ran his harvester over the formation, most of the flattened circle wheat went into his machine. But the backward F, the other strange glyphs, and the double rings all seemed to be more tightly flattened to the ground and did not chop up into his harvester. Jeff Wilson, who has investigated dozens of crop formations in the United States over the past decade, told me that at first glance the pattern in the aerial photographs did not appear to be very sophisticated like what we have seen in England. But when he and his team began to study what was left after the harvester, they found many fascinating anomalies, including one never seen in an American crop formation before.
Where the rings touch the circle on both sides of this formation, the flow or the flattening of the ring pathway flows into the circle on both sides, which, of course, was a real puzzle to us when we first were walking the perimeter of the circle, because how can the rings both flow into the circle on both sides? And it turns out that there is divergence in the flow from near the center point of the ring. The whole formation is kind of laid out on a slope, and where this divergence occurs, the flow goes up the hill and into the circle, and the flow goes down the hill and into the circle, both ways, so it divides them back and forth.
And if I understand from your own discovery and excellent diagram, you have now found that where there is, we'll call that kind of airline part, that there is another little piece that seems to be like a keystone or center point that lines right up with where they part and go in two directions.
Yes, kind of to the north-northeast of the main body of the formation. There was an area of randomly down of flattened wheat, and within this section there was a little L-shaped notch or a flattened area, and that appears to be part of the geometry of the formation itself, and that's like the keystone for unraveling how the geometry works inside the rest of the formation. And so that lies on this center line that divides the part in the two rings, but also goes through the center point of the circle and through this little keystone pathway. And all the rest of the geometry kind of flows and is connected to that point.
How many times in American formations have you found something like a keystone some distance outside of a pattern?
I would say I can't think of a particular formation in which this occurred.
I can't either. And the only one that really comes to mind is the one that was in England about 3 years ago, where there was a land survey marker that was 200 or 300 years old. That again, it was many meters from the main formation, but everything lined up around that.
And it's interesting, too, that you mentioned that other formation that had that survey marker as the keystone, because right adjacent to this little, what we're calling the keystone, is an actual survey marker. A geodesic survey marker is in the field right at that corner point right next to it.
Farmer found this, I believe, on June 25th and thought that it might have been there longer. I understand that there was a power failure in that area around June 22nd, 3 days before, perhaps linked to a thunderstorm, but sometimes power failures have been linked to the time when formations have occurred, at least in England in some places.
Right. Well, that's a good point. During that rain shower, the local neighborhood, the houses nearby, including the house in which David Ring's son and daughter-in-law live, and the local airport, which is adjacent to this field, all of those people reported not a power outage, but a voltage loss. The power dimmed dramatically, so much so that they said that their light bulbs were just barely flickering on. And they called and reported this to the power company. It seemed to be fairly widespread within the immediate area surrounding the formation that there was this power dimming that took place. Power outages or power dimming do seem to be somewhat related to the times at which crop circle formations are reported in a local area. A lot of people have reported this in the past. Even though it's very close to the airport, it's in a place that's perpendicular to the local runway. So as planes are approaching the runways or taking off from the runways, they're not flying over this spot exactly. They're coming in at a completely different angle. And so it didn't surprise me that nobody from any of the airplanes flying in or out of that had reported this before a farmer found it while he was harvesting. It's also kind of shielded from the airport by a pretty tall grove of trees. And so anybody flying low in or out of the runways, that would have blocked their vision also.
And you know something this seems to underscore this whole question of why do crop formations appear where they do? And in this case, it may be that the mound question, the ancient history of the land, has more to do with why this seemingly somewhat humble but quite fascinating pattern was placed in this modern world at such a strange side of a hill near an airport, 400 feet from a road, that it might not have anything to do with the modern time, that might have something to do with ancient lineups.
That could very well be, because this particular area of southwest Indiana is pretty full of ancient Native American mounds, and we find that the formations throughout the Midwest are coming down in the areas where the mounds are located. One of the interesting, curious aspects that I kind of uncovered as I was looking through the historical record on what could be nearby in the county or outside the county, there is a very large Mississippian city called Angel Mound, where there were several large pyramids that's near Evansville, Indiana, which is about 40 miles to the southwest of where the crop circle location is. And anywhere surrounding it for about 70 miles is just filled with Native American mounds across this whole region.
Why were they called angel mounds?
Well, typically archaeologists, when they discover and excavate a site, name it after the current landowner. At the time that angel mounds were excavated back in the 1920s, the family name was Angel, so they named it after them. Many of the mound sites in the United States, particularly, there is a school of thought in which the mounds may have been placed in certain locations because there were magnetic anomalies or electromagnetic anomalies in those particular areas that the Native Americans could feel. There is also a second line of thought. In centuries past, the dominant species of animal in North America and really around the world was the passenger pigeon. And the passenger pigeon, there were literally billions of these passenger pigeons, and they would migrate in flocks of up to 60 miles long, and they would just block out the sun as they flew on their migratory pattern. Well, they seem to fly along certain migratory routes in which we find all of the major geometric earthworks in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be a relationship between where the geometric earthworks were placed and the migratory patterns of the birds that were flying at the same time.
Which would tie in probably to the magnetic lines of the Earth.
Right. There have been recent studies that show that migratory birds do follow the magnetic field lines, but that they actually seem to have a sense embedded within them that actually allows them to actually see the magnetic field lines of the planet. And if they could see the magnetic field lines, they could see where these anomalies were. And then you'd see the birds kind of spiraling around above these magnetic anomalies, right, wherever they would occur, wherever these little spirals or eddies of the magnetic field would occur. Well, it turns out that in the case of this Huntingburg crop circle formation, this formation falls along one of these migratory patterns. In fact, if you just go a little bit to the southwest of where this formation occurred, that township is called Pigeon Township. And it was named that because that was one of the spawning places of the passenger pigeon. And if you continue farther southwest, you hit the Pigeon River, in which that waterway was one of the major spawning grounds and roosting grounds for the passenger pigeon. And if you continue on that same trajectory, you hit the Angel Mound. If you go in the opposite direction, going northeast, 2 or 3 miles north of Huntingburg, there is a mound that is written about in the history of Dubois County, Indiana, which Huntingburg is part of, in which there is a mound that was excavated. They found there that the top several inches of the earth was nothing more than pigeon dropping, and that they dug through the pigeon droppings to get to the mound itself to then excavate the burial when the archaeologists were looking at it. So the passenger pigeons were on this same trajectory in the route, and this formation appears to fall right along that line.
Energy anomalies have been long linked to crop formations wherever they have occurred in the planet, and I have just learned that the manager of the Huntingburg Airport on the night of June 22nd which was 3 days before the farmer found this pattern, got a call from 9/11 at the night during the storm saying that systems had shut down suddenly at the Huntingburg airport. And when he got there, he said that it was eerie, that all of the light bulbs were just barely showing a glow, while all the other electronic systems were off. And he had never seen anything like that before.
Well, Linda, it's the two things about it. The first thing is that it's happening in the United States, and the second is that the electronic anomalies are very unusual. That there would be any at all. I don't think we associate that with this phenomenon elsewhere, do we?
Well, it generally has been something reported often in England, where there have been these strange power outages at the time when people estimated that crop formations occurred. I've written about that in my work and reported.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that, I'm embarrassed to say.
Well, it is part of the mystery of crop formations, and part of this one in Indiana that is so intriguing is not only was there really a very unusual power lowering, not a complete outage, but this dimming, and has not been explained. The power company has not been able to explain this to the local residents to this day. There have always been magnetic anomalies measured when people have had magnetometers, and that is something that Jeff Wilson is working on right now. It may be another week or two before he has the analysis done. But
I actually did that. I personally have experienced that with a magnetometer. It was not a crop circle. It had to be the most humble crop circle I've ever known. We were telephoned by a rancher in South Texas. This was back when Bill Mallow, Southwest Research, was still alive, and we were very active at the time. And he had tried to call the MUFON people, Walter Andrus in Seguin, Texas, and been blown off immediately, of course. And So he got in touch with me via my website. A gentleman, a rancher down in South Texas, a cattle feeder, not a big rancher, in other words, a small-time guy, and he had a circle in his feedlot. It just, you could barely even see it because, of course, it had been trampled down by the cattle. But what was so odd about it, and what had made it so easy to find that circle, was that the cattle all stood in a circle around it with their heads in it. And after moving the cattle off, we took a magnetometer to the circle, and it was very strange. The readings we got were really, really bizarre. And the other thing that was strange is when you moved the magnetometer rapidly in the circle, it seemed to build up an electrical charge in the magnetometer. It was a very, very odd thing. And we also, in examining the soil, later at Southwest Research, found tiny bits of magnetized iron all through the soil from the circle, but not from anywhere else. Right. In addition to this, we found when we got back that every time our video camera had been pointed at the circle, it had not picked up a picture. But when it was moved away from the circle, the picture reappeared.
These kinds of magnetic anomalies have been repeated and repeated in so many places.
But when I was in the circle, I was suddenly overcome by such severe weakness that I had to get in the car. I nearly collapsed. And I slept basically all the way back to San Antonio from South Texas. It was devastating, the experience, for me.
Well, some people have had that reaction in crop formation as well. Other people are totally exhilarated. There is a difference in the crop formation. And one thing I would like to share with you and our Dreamland audience is a word picture that the biophysicist W.C. Levengood has painted for me about what he thinks is happening, and that is the spinning plasma vortex is pinching, that's a word that physicists use, is pinching magnetic field lines, causing a distortion. as these energy systems are spiraling down to the earth and interacting with the plants. He does not know the source of that spiraling, but the combination of the pinched magnetic field, microwave and other energies, and ion avalanches in some places, which cause completely different impacts on the plants than the microwave energy, are what produce these complex patterns in the field and leave a magnetic distortion for a period of time that he thinks can be picked up, can affect cameras, and in some cases, that melted iron that we have found now in several dozen crop formations and not found it outside, he thinks was meteoritic dust caught up in this magnetic and ion spinning plasma as it's brought down to the ground and heated up and sprayed only in the formation. And in one or two of the patterns that he has investigated, there have been 750 times more magnetite, which is the form of iron that will jump to a magnet, in the crops actually sprayed on the plants, where none of that could be found in any of the surrounding ground. And this, Whitley,
this is precisely what we found. Precisely what we found. And it is such a mystery, and Linda, and I'd like to thank you very much. We're now going to go on. William Henry is with us with Michael Baigent. This is going to be quite an incredible and extraordinary interview. Michael has been in the news lately in his dispute with Dan Brown of the Da Vinci Code. I'm not so sure they're going to be talking about that, but what they are going to be talking about is the discoveries that Michael has made in his new book, The Jesus Papers, which has been a bit overshadowed by the controversies in the news. But this is a phenomenal book, and these discoveries are really remarkable. We'll be right back.
From Nashville, this is William Henry sitting in for Whitley Strieber. This is Dreamland. Welcome, everyone. 20 years ago, Michael Baigent and his colleagues stunned the world with a controversial theory that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and founded a holy bloodline. His best-selling book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, with authors Henry Lincoln and Richard Lee, became an international publishing phenomenon and was one of the sources for Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code. Now, with 2 additional decades of research behind them, Michael Baigent's The Jesus Papers presents explosive new evidence that challenges everything we know about the life and death of Jesus. Michael Baigent, welcome to Dreamland.
Hi, William. Good to be with you.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us. I have to get a personal note out of the way, if you don't mind. I was one of those sophomores at a small Southern Baptist college in Nashville in 1982 when Holy Blood, Holy Grail was published. It absolutely changed my life. I mean, I remember I was in a sophomore religion class, and the professor assigned us to review a book whose implications would impact Christianity. And I was fortunate enough to pick up your book, and I wrote a review of it. Unfortunately, the professor flunked me, and he said, "Hey, are you sure you want to go to school at a small Southern Baptist school?" And, of course, I wasn't sure. And I was certain, though, that Holy Blood, Holy Grail had a power pack within it that changed my life. It was like a blast from a supernova, and I'm sure you get the same reaction from millions of others, but I just wanted to begin with a heartfelt thank you for all the incredible work that you've done. I think you've got to be one of the bravest people on the planet right now.
Well, that's wonderful that you liked it. I mean, it changed our life, too. It took my life over, sort of grabbed it by the scruff of the neck and kicked it off into the far distance. I had no idea where we were going to end up when we started work on that book, and we just followed the story, really. And, look where it took us.
And, of course, the Messianic Legacy followed soon after, which had some of your reflections on it and got more into detail on one of the subjects we want to talk about today, which is Jesus' connection with the Zealots. But before we do that, I wanted to note that I think that of all the contributions your books make, the single most powerful concept that I derived is that there are really only 2 forms of Christianity: the descriptive religion about the dead Jesus, which mass Christianity indoctrinates people in, and then the pure religion of the living Jesus, which, as you note, can only come from within. So I wondered if we could begin there, Michael, with some of your thoughts on that concept of the true pure religion of the living Jesus.
Well, this is the whole point of the book, The Jesus Papers, and I'm profoundly grateful that you've honed into it so quickly. I mean, this is the 1,500 years of cover-up that I'm talking about, that in the 4th century, they created this theological concept of Jesus. They made him into a god, a pagan god, effectively. And by doing this, they silenced the man underneath. And if you look at the man underneath, you find someone who's teaching in an extraordinary spiritual system which has no gender distinctions. I mean, it's open to men and women. There's none of this nonsense of a male-dominated apostolic succession. None of that's there. He's not claiming to be God. He's saying that everybody has within them some divinity and that they can discover that for themselves. It's experiential, it's individual, it's mystical, it's initiatory. It has to do with each man and woman approaching, finding, and experiencing divinity for themselves. And by doing this, though he's working in a Jewish tradition, this tradition of this individual and experiential approach to spirituality, this tradition goes right across the ancient world. We find it in Egypt, Greece, Rome, and that's why in my book I go on a 2 or 3 chapter excursion, taking the reader on a journey through these other systems, so that the reader can become familiar with the techniques and the metaphors used to describe it, because of course the events, this kind of experience is really beyond the capabilities of language to express it.
That's right, and that's one of the things I so appreciated, especially when you took us to Egypt, because you noted that one of the key things that you have to do when you're in the temples is actually feel them and embrace them. Yeah. And I thought that was such a key statement. So why don't we talk about that just for a moment, because very often when you see depictions of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, there are these holier-than-thou kind of depictions and often very solemn. They never show them, and what I would suggest is their native habitat, the temples of Egypt, of Iran and Iraq even, and other places. So let's talk about what that temple experience must have been like.
Well, the point of the temples, I mean, what's the point of any religion? It's to guide or aid people towards experiencing divinity for themselves. But what so often happens is the religion starts getting more interested in sustaining its own organization. But the temples, the beauty of the temples was, especially in ancient Egypt and many other countries, is that they were there, they existed primarily to serve what was called ma'at in Egypt, which is this universal harmony. And the idea was that by maintaining a relationship between this world and the next world, or which the Egyptians called the Duat, the far world, which is this world of the spiritual beings, this world of divinity, by maintaining the constant harmonious relationship between these two worlds, our world and that world, then the harmony of the universe was maintained. And so the whole point of the priesthood, of the temples, was to maintain this harmony, to constantly keep these two worlds in conjunction with each other and in balance with each other. And of course, they had techniques, as I explain in the book, for moving from one world to the other and coming back again. In a sense, learning about the world of the dead before they died. This was what initiation was all about. And this is what I believe Jesus was teaching. His message of love, forgiveness, and compassion was how one could live within the world. But he was also teaching an inner teaching, which was how to move to the world, to the divine world itself. And he called this the kingdom of God. And the question I ask in the book is, what does he mean when he says, or when he terms something moving to the kingdom of God, or understanding the kingdom of God? And this is something I'm exploring.
And so what do you think the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God was in their conception?
It's his metaphor for this divine world, which is possible to move to if you have the key. It's the same world that the Romans called the Elysian Fields, that the Greeks called Hades, that the Egyptians called the Duat, the far world. It's the world, the spiritual world, which lies behind the appearances of this world, the world that we live in, the world that we move in. And it's the world that after death one moves to. It's let's just call it the the other world. It's an easy sort of concept, I think, for people to understand. And I think that we have this innate longing to know and to travel to this other world. And I think this longing is very much part of our religious impulse. We want to know who we are. We want to know why we are here. We have this longing for this completion, to know both worlds. And I think what happens with religions is they stand between a person and their knowledge of the other world, and it gives them enormous power. And I think that's why a lot of religions don't want people to have the freedom of knowing for themselves this divine world. But certainly Jesus was involved in that. I mean, there's this wonderful quote in the New Testament, on several parts of the New Testament, where he says to his disciples, you know, he gives the parables for the people out there, the public, but he comes back and gives the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven to his disciples. I mean, Matthew 13 is a good example of that. It's clear he has this dual message, this dual teaching.
Yeah, and one of my favorite statements in response to a question by Mary Magdalene, it's in the Pistis Sophia, and he says explicitly, do not cease seeking day or night, and do not let yourselves relax until you have found all the mysteries of the kingdom of light, which will purify you and make you into pure light and lead you into the kingdom of light. It can't
Absolutely.
get much plainer than that is the whole purpose here. And as you talk in the book, that is probably the reason why Jesus vanished from Palestine during his youth and young adulthood, and it appears went to Egypt, where, as you describe, it appears there was a fully functioning Jewish temple that may.
It doesn't appear there was a fully functioning Jewish temple there. That's no conjecture or hypothesis on my part. That's the fact of history.
Let's talk about that temple, because this is such a key part of the Jesus story that's omitted in traditional Christianity, his sojourn and time and training in Egypt. So please tell us about this temple.
Well, it was set up around about 170 BC. What happened was the Syrians invaded Egypt, which at that time was part of the Egyptian Empire. Under the pharaoh at the time was Ptolemy VII. And the high priest in Jerusalem, who was rather like a viceroy, he was the representative, really, of the pharaoh in Israel. He controlled the financial side of Israel, he controlled the military side of Israel, and of course he was the high priest of the temple. And he was of the particular bloodline of those who were destined to serve in the temple. His name was Onias. And when the armies of Antiochus Epiphanes invaded from Syria, there was quite a battle. The temple got looted. Onias had to flee into exile with quite a number of his priests. The Syrian king set up a new line of priests to operate the temple, but they weren't of this pure line. The pure line went with Onias through to Egypt, and Onias was a friend of Ptolemy VII, and so he asked for an old temple, a ruined temple at Bubastis that he had found in the Nile Delta. And Ptolemy gave this to Onias, and Onias rebuilt it as a Jewish temple. And it lasted, actually, for the next 150 or more years. It lasted till a later date than the temple in Jerusalem. And the interesting thing to me was that this, in a sense, was the only legitimate Jewish temple, because it was the only temple served by priests still of this legitimate line. Now, to sort of put this into some kind of historical context for people, it was this invasion by the Syrians that caused the Maccabean revolt. Judas Maccabee was the leader of the faction that utterly opposed this invasion. So when we talk of the book of Maccabees, for example, we're talking of this political instability which followed the Syrian invasion. But already Onias had gone to the Delta and had founded another temple there. But this temple seems to have been operating a system that was Zadokite. That is, it had a line of priests of the line of Zadok, but it doesn't seem to have been politically involved, as were these particular people in Israel. And one of the distinctions I make in the book is that Jesus withdrew from his political involvement. And this, for me, was a major reorientation that I had to do, because I'd always seen Jesus as very committed to the political process in Israel, because Jesus is surrounded by zealots, but he broke with them, and I think that caused a problem.
Yeah, and one of the other points I wanted to talk with you about too, Michael, is that I interviewed Robert Feather, who wrote a book called The Secret Initiation of Jesus at Qumran, and he talked about that the zealots and even the Zadokites themselves had a real problem with the temple high priest, and the Essenes seem to have had a problem with the temple itself. And that's why I was so just on the edge of my seat when all of a sudden you're telling us about this temple in Egypt that is modeled or built on the same design as the temple in Jerusalem. And I'm wondering, wow, there's a real problem going on in Jerusalem at that time among these groups. There's something bogus about the Temple of Solomon, and it continues to this day because they've continued to cover up whatever that problem was and don't really seem to want to talk about the existence of a duplicate of this temple in Egypt.
So this is a very curious matter. Even scholars, as you say, to this day are trying to sideline this Egyptian temple. They're trying to say it wasn't founded by Anias the high priest, but it was founded by his son. His son was a general in the Egyptian army. Why would he found a temple? They're trying to make it illegitimate, to make it irrelevant. And even at the time, the top the leaders of the Jewish community in Alexandria, Philo and his brother being the financial controller of Egypt, they looked towards Jerusalem. They ignored this temple in the Delta. So there was some sensitivity both then and now, and one has to ask the question, what were they scared of? What was this temple teaching that made them want to run away from it? And what's very curious is that if you look at the Jewish experience in Egypt at the time, you find there's a very, very strong mystical strand running through it. You've got descriptions of this group called the Therapeutai, who are both men and women living in retreat near Alexandria, who regarded the entire Old Testament as allegory. They saw them as simply stories which hid a greater truth of this divinity underlying life. And of course, a prime example of this, which I talk about in my book, is the concept of Jacob's ladder. And the important thing of Jacob's ladder, that this vision of the dynamic connection between this life and the other life, or this world and the other world, because Jacob described angels toing and froing on the ladder, i.e., there was a coming and a going. There's this dynamic interchange between the two. It's imminent. It's always there. It's always available. And then we had books like the Book of Enoch coming out of Egypt. And the Book of Enoch has a section describing this extraordinary mystical ascent, which is deeply personal, deeply passionate. You just don't get that in the Dead Sea Scrolls or in the political ideology of the Zealot movement in Judea and Galilee. And that's why I say that Jesus could not have learned his mysticism there. I mean, there's that wonderful statement by Jesus in Luke where he said, "When thy eye be single, thy whole body is filled with light." I mean, this is a recognition not only of the innate divinity of everybody, but of the one underlying all existence. It's as mystical a statement as you'll find in any tradition in the world.
Oh, I totally agree. And when we get back to the living religion of Jesus, or the religion of the living Jesus, we talk about the elements. We have earth, air, fire, and water. And then in the East, they have a fifth element they call this fifth element wood, but it's also known as the quintessence, the life force energy. When we come back to these stories that Jesus is a carpenter, a woodworker, what kind of wood exactly are we talking about?
Right.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Mr. Michael Baigent. Michael, just before the break, we were talking about this idea of Jesus as a woodworker and looking into this idea that what if he was a light worker and interested in the secrets of light? What are your thoughts on that possibility?
Well, I think that's certainly what he was interested in, and I hadn't heard that connection of wood with the the ground of being or the light that you just made. I think that's very interesting because, of course, the word carpenter in the Bible comes from the Greek word tekton, which derives from Platonism, really, which is an architect or creator. So again, we've got a spiritual meaning, which is finding expression through this kind of trade description, which is very interesting. But I hadn't heard about that description you gave, but I find that perfectly plausible and certainly fits what I've written.
Right, and so now we're developing the picture. Here's a young man, a boy, who goes to this, let's call it a secret temple in Egypt, and maybe he's learning some of these principles. I mean, I don't want to make this analogy necessarily, but it's almost like he's like Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, learning all about the Force. And when he returns to Palestine, he is a force to be reckoned with. But one of the things I loved about the Jesus Papers in particular is this connection that you make with the Zealots. I mean, that's a key piece. Who were these people, and why does it bring such a different perspective to this Jesus story?
Well, I have to sort of backtrack a bit on that. I wrote with a colleague a book on the Dead Sea Scrolls about 15 years ago, and we did quite a study of the Zealots. Now, the Zealots were a pretty large part of the population of Judea and Galilee who hated the Roman domination and who hated particularly the fact that the high priests had been appointed by the puppet kings, the Herodian kings. And the Herodian kings, of course, weren't of any Jewish bloodline either. So what the Zealots wanted was to get rid of the Romans and to have a high priest and a king of a pure Jewish lineage, of the line of David and the line of Aaron. And the Zealot movement started around about 6 AD with Judas of Galilee. And the key question they asked was, would you pay the taxes to Rome or not? And if you said you would pay the taxes to Rome, then they saw you as an enemy and may well have executed you. If you said you wouldn't pay it, then you were one of them. You were a supporter of the Zealots. And this instability, social instability, continued because the Zealots were a very hardline bunch. And when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find that they came out of the general Zealot movement, because within the scrolls we find behind the spiritual ideology of the scrolls, we find this political ideology that's revealed, and it's totally focused on getting rid of these foreign invaders, the Katim, they call them in the scrolls. Now, I'd always seen Jesus as being part of the Zealot movement, an integral part, because when Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, he said, why are you arresting me? Do you take me for a zealot? This is in the Greek text of the New Testament, which shows that Jesus and the person who wrote the gospel understood the political reality of the time. When Jesus was crucified, which was, we have to remember, a Roman execution, not a Jewish one, he was crucified between two zealots. We had Simon Zelotim, a zealot, as one of the disciples. We had Judas Iscariot. Iscariot comes from Sicarii, which is the knife that the zealots would carry and were notorious for assassinating people with. So there's a lot of zealots around Jesus. But when Jesus stood up in the temple and was handed a denarius and asked, who should this be paid to? Jesus, by saying, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, i.e., pay the tax to Rome. By saying that, on the one hand, he's breaking totally with the zealots, so they would have been outraged with him, and he was also supporting Rome by saying, pay the taxes. And why did he say that? Because he said, my kingdom is not of this world, which shows the mystical perspective Jesus was coming from, and this again would have further outraged the zealots. And the argument I make in the book, and it's just an argument along the way of the journey that the reader goes on through the book, is that this gave Pilate the most extraordinary problem, because Pilate was prefect of Judea. He was effectively there to represent Roman policy. What was Roman policy? They had two main factors. One, keep the peace in Judea. Two, make sure the taxes go back to Rome. So, on the one hand, Jesus standing up and breaking with the zealots was an open invitation to social conflict. Obviously, the zealots would be baying for his blood, but by Jesus saying pay the taxes, he was supporting Roman policy. There is no way, as a historian, that I can see that Pilate could have allowed Jesus to be executed. He had to make sure that he survived the crucifixion. He had to square the circle. He had to make it look like Jesus was killed, but he had to make sure he survived. And if you then ask the question, how would it be possible to survive a crucifixion? Because it was a terrible execution. You have to reduce the trauma, get him off the cross fast, minister to him medically as quickly as possible. We find those three things are actually detailed in the Gospels. And what's very interesting is that when Jesus was put into the tomb, very quickly, after the beginning of Passover, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus went to the tomb with medicinal spices, not embalming spices, but spices to stop blood flow and so on. They went and ministered to him. Now, if he'd been dead, they wouldn't have touched a dead body after Passover because they would have been rendered ritually unclean. So even that, in the Gospels, is a little hint that Jesus had survived the crucifixion.
Very interesting. And, you know, on this idea that Pilate might have had some secret respect for Jesus, there's a notation that Dr. Jean Houston makes in her book, God Seed, the Journey of Christ. In it, she talks about Christos, or Christos as do you, and noting that it means the great silly or blessed one, which is also a Druid term of respect. And she says that in one of the apocryphal traditions, Pilate is supposed to have said to Jesus upon the pillar or the cross, Ein Christos, you are the great silly. And she thinks that this is a derogatory statement, but when we understand that the term silly was a term meaning blessed one by the Druids, it kind of hints the possibility that Pilate had some secret respect for Jesus. What do you think?
Well, it's possible. I mean, that's all I could say to that. I mean, Pilate was a thoroughly nasty piece of work. We have to take that on board. And what he knew about Jesus, I don't really know, but I think even just from his point of view, however cynically he may have been thinking about it, he must have colluded on helping Jesus survive that crucifixion. Whether he had a secret respect for him or not, I have no idea. There's just not evidence that I know of that could lead me to take that step. Whether he had a secret respect for anybody is a moot point. I mean, if we read about Pilate from other documents, we find that he really is a nasty piece of work.
Mm-hmm. Michael, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you another question about this otherworldly aspect of the crucifixion. One of my favorite stories comes from the book of Numbers when Joshua and Caleb, two thieves, go into Canaan and steal an oversized cluster of grapes from the sons of Anak, who are connected with the sons of God. And they return to Moses with this cluster of grapes, and then afterward it disappears. It's not mentioned in the Bible ever again, but seemingly they have stolen something very profound from the sons of the gods. Later, at the cathedral in Sion, Switzerland, we see the two thieves crucified alongside of Jesus, who would be zealots. They are carrying this very same cluster of grapes and bring it to the crucifixion. What are your thoughts on this possibility that the zealots were in fact preservers of the ancient past? I'm going to give you a moment to think about that. We have to take a quick break, and perhaps we can talk about that when we continue. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Mr. Michael Baigent. And Michael, as noted before the break, we're talking about wondering if the zealots were preserving ancient spiritual disciplines from the past, if they connected themselves with the past, and why at the cathedral at Sion they would portray the two zealot thieves carrying this cluster of grapes, which seems to symbolize some kind of otherworldly substance to the crucifixion.
That's all I can say is that's a very intriguing thought, because of course grapes too, the whole idea of viticulture has this idea of the grafting of bloodlines, the merging of bloodlines. And certainly with the birth of Jesus, we had this merging of bloodlines because he was of the bloodline of the high priests and he was also of the bloodline of kings. And so one is drawn inevitably to the conclusion that his birth came as a result of dynastic marriage, dynastic alliances. The Zealots must have known much about this. What we don't know is why the Zealots were so focused upon the politics to the exclusion of the mystical. And this is why the temple in Egypt is so important, because it seems to have retained the ancient traditions without getting tangled into the contemporary politics. Because I think for anyone around about 30 AD or 40 AD who looked at the political situation, they would have seen that there's no conceivable way that the Jewish nation could beat the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. There had to be some other way of sorting this position out. And I think that Jesus' message of forgiveness and compassion was not only a wonderful message, as true today as it was then, but it's also probably the only practical way of maintaining harmony in what was a very, very torn society at the time. But unfortunately, the hardline zealots insisted eventually on creating a revolt, creating a war. And one can understand why they did it, but it ended up with the destruction of their world, really. This idea of the grapes, my feeling would be that any secrets of this type would be found in the hands of those at the temple in Egypt or in the Therapeutai, because it was the zealots in Israel tended to take things quite literally, whereas the Therapeutai saw the whole Old Testament as a metaphor symbolizing something far greater, something far deeper, something more profound. But of course we don't have any of their original writings, so we can't really draw any conclusions. We only know their motives.
Yeah, and on this idea of, let's just continue and say, okay, let's say these grapes did symbolize some kind of an otherworldly substance. It brings me to something you describe in the Jesus Papers as the two letters written to the Jewish court, the Sanhedrin, by a writer who called himself the Messiah. Tell us about these letters and their significance.
Well, these are two papyrus letters. I heard about them sort of on the grapevine, so to speak, and I eventually managed to contact the fellow who had them, and he was deeply worried about them. I mean, he didn't want to show anyone, he didn't want to talk about them, he had them, kept them locked away in a large vault, not in his home. And after some months, he came to trust me enough to take me to where they were and show them to me. But of course, I held them, but I could see, I've had enough dealings with ancient manuscripts to know that they were certainly old, they were on papyrus, they were written in Aramaic or Hebrew. In fact, it was Aramaic, but I find it very difficult to tell the difference between the two. But it was extraordinarily frustrating for me because I can't read them, and I wanted to take them to a good scholar, but he wouldn't let me take them away, he wouldn't let me photograph them. What he told me they said is that they were a letter from Bani Mashiach, which means the Messiah of the children of Israel, to the Sanhedrin. And he's obviously been accused of claiming that he's God. And what he's doing, he's writing back saying, no, you've got it all wrong. I'm not claiming I'm God. I'm claiming that I'm filled with the Spirit of God. Now, there's three possibilities with these two fragments. One is that they are what they say they are, that they are a direct letter written by the Messiah to the Sanhedrin. Or they could be a report by the Sanhedrin of that particular incident, reporting that the Messiah wrote back to the Sanhedrin. Or they could be an early version of what later became John's Gospel, because I was struck at the time by the similarity between this incident and the incident in John 10:33-35, where Jesus is accused of being God, and he replies that everyone who listens to the word of God are themselves gods. He quotes from Psalm 82. And it seems to me that this is the same incident reported in a slightly different manner. So until I can get hold of these documents and give them to a good scholar to do a full translation and a full analysis of the context, then we can't know for certain what they are. But I have to say they pull the plug entirely on this Vatican spin, this 4th century overview that was placed on Jesus, because this brings us right back to the historical Jesus, the man who never claimed to be God, who never claimed he was starting a religion, but who wanted everyone to discover their own innate divinity for themselves. He was a man who showed people the way, who took them there, and he called this the kingdom of heaven.
And by saying that he's filled with the Spirit of God, it suggests that he might have known a technique whereby the average individual could also do so. And this brings me to my next question, which is, where does Mary Magdalene fill in this picture here? Because she seems to have played a key role in filling him with that Spirit, certainly anointing him, and must have, in my view, from the research I've looked at anyway, must have had a real understanding of his true message. So where's Mary Magdalene?
I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, at the end of the 2nd century, or during the course of the 2nd century, women were fulfilling a role in the Christian church equal to those of the men. It was the end of the 2nd century that people like Tertullian and Irenaeus, who clearly hated women, began to push a strain of Christianity which excluded women effectively, and this is the strain which became the Orthodox strain. And so we end up with this nonsense now where people even question whether women can be priests or bishops or even pope. I mean, it's so stupid, it's hardly even worth arguing about, except that an enormous number of people still adhere to this line. Now, it's quite clear, again, nothing was written down about Jesus until the 2nd century A.D. There's nothing we can hold in our hand that dates from the 1st century A.D. that has anything to do with the Gospels. It's the 2nd century that they appear. And if we look at the 2nd century, we get a very wide range of documents that are written. Christianity was obviously a very rich and very diverse tradition at that stage. And among the documents, we have quite a number which show that Jesus had a very easy relationship with the women among his followers. Some of this, of course, has ended up in the New Testament. I mean, we think of the easy chat which Jesus had with the woman by the well, for example, or we find that the wife of Herod's steward, for example, his prime minister, was among Jesus' followers. But we also have this very close relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene appearing. And if, for example, they hadn't been married, then that close relationship would have been scandalous in the context of the times. We also have a gospel of Mary Magdalene herself. And in this gospel, it makes it plain that Mary understood Jesus' mystical message, and understood better, perhaps, than most of the other disciples. The gospel depicts the other disciples, or some of them at least, being angered over the fact that Mary had receiving this privilege of secret information from Jesus. And I think this is simply describing a reality. Mary was integrally involved with the teaching. Precisely what her role was, we don't know, but the fact that I think she was the same person as Mary of Bethany, and Mary of Bethany is the one who anointed Jesus. I would argue this anointing is him being anointed Messiah. So there's something very interesting and profound going on there which has been completely lost from the Christian tradition. It's hard to figure out precisely what it is, but we're left with the fact that Jesus was anointed Messiah by a woman who was probably his wife. Now that's a very interesting situation.
This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Michael Baigent. Michael, just before the break, we've been talking about Mary Magdalene and the possibility that they were married, and there's very good researchers that make the claim that Mary Magdalene herself was trained in the temples of Egypt. Have you found any evidence to support that notion?
I haven't found any evidence to support either Mary or Jesus being trained in the temple in Egypt. It's just that we have to ask the question, where did he discover his mystical teaching? He wouldn't have discovered it in Judea and Galilee, and the only place that it was part of the Jewish teaching is in Egypt. And so, by that argument, he had to have learned it in Egypt. But it's conjecture on my part, but it's very plausible conjecture. But because of that, there's no proof whatsoever, unfortunately, which is not to say that something might come out of the clandestine antiquities network in due course, because documents are out there, real treasures are out there, and stuff is popping out all the time. So I think we're living in exciting times because much more material is appearing. And what's also very good is that a lot of good scholars have now gained the courage, really, to ask some quite radical questions. I mean, I'm reminded just recently with this Gospel of Judas that appeared, the scholars who were involved with that are really asking tough questions of Christianity as a result, and are really investigating some very arcane areas. And I think this is good, because now that the scholars are no longer frightened of losing their university seats, they are going to start embracing a few more alternative ideas, and they will find more material, I'm sure. So we're in very, very exciting times, and I'm very hopeful that a lot of this material, especially the mystical side of Jesus, will become more and more to the fore.
Oh, I agree. I mean, it's about time for the crack in the cosmic egg. And before we go on, though, I wanted to ask you one more question about Egypt here. I've always been intrigued by some of the earliest examples of art used for Christian purposes, and those are those that are found in the catacombs of Rome, and most of them dated around 150 to 250 A.D., and in these depictions, Jesus is portrayed short-haired, clean-shaven, and performing his miracles with what we might describe as a magic wand. These depictions, especially when Jesus is portrayed raising Lazarus, precisely match Thoth or Tahuti in Egypt raising Osiris. Have you looked into the connection between this relationship of Thoth raising Osiris and Jesus and the raising of Lazarus?
Well, I certainly think that the raising of Lazarus is a sort of a garbled version of one of Jesus's initiations, put it that way. And certainly in ancient Egypt, the priests used these wands. They had a whole different range of wands. If you go into the temples and look at the chapels where, especially the Osiris chapels, especially at the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, there's some beautifully colored
one of my favorite places,
depictions of this. You can see that there's all kinds of different wands depending on which part of the ritual they're involved in. Now, the Osiris raising ritual, or the bringing of the king to the state of Osiris, is one thing, but I think what we can also understand is more people other than the king himself also went through this ceremony, also had this ritual. And the Egyptians certainly were involved in rituals taking people, presumably other priests. I don't know how far this moved into the public arena, but at least other priests across to this other world. They allowed them to have this experience, and there's these underground crypts in many of the temples, and many of which I've been into, where it's my belief that this is where the ceremonies took place, because we have certain writers have mentioned these secret rooms where by candlelight these rituals are conducted. There's little tidbits of information, because this material was all very secret, we have to understand. People weren't allowed to talk about it, and so we just have snippets emerging here and there in particular writings, and I've brought a few of these snippets together in the book so that we can see how it progresses.
And speaking of initiation and tunnels, I was on the edge of my seat reading your chapter 10 called Initiation, about going into the tunnels at Baia in northern Italy.
Oh, Baia's the most amazing place I've ever been. And of course, you know, it's my friend Robert Temple, who's just had a book published, I think, in the States, which spends a lot of time describing his work with Baia. It's just a truly amazing place, and just I absolutely want to excavate it because it's filled with rubble. The underground temple was all sealed up after having been filled with rubble, and I think they would have just smashed all the objects up inside it and put the rubble on top, because if they were so scared of this place, which they clearly were, they wouldn't have wanted to take those objects out, because they would have perhaps been too superstitious to have them with them. So I think underneath all the rubble there's going to be everything there. That's my hope. And hopefully Robert and I will get the chance.
And you were the first person in, over 1,500 years to enter some of the deepest parts of this tunnel system?
Well, actually, I think I was the second. I think one other person, well, I don't know, because I found some things there which the person who first found it in the early 60s, and is now dead, and the Italian government sealed this underground complex up, and it wasn't until 20 or 30 years later that Robert Temple got permission to reopen it. And Robert and I went in again for the first time. I crawled along these little tunnels which had about 18 inches between the top of the rubble and the top of the tunnel. And I found a few things down there which hadn't been reported before, so it's quite possible that the two people who first discovered it didn't go down those tunnels, or at least didn't get to the end of them. But, you know, even if they did, Robert and I were still probably among the first half dozen in 2,000 years to get down into those. They're truly extraordinary.
Absolutely.
It's a wonderful thing to be going hundreds of feet down this narrow tunnel deep into a cliff face, and then to find an underground river and an underground temple and tunnels leading off in all kinds of directions, some of them filled with rubble, and so we don't know where they go. And there's obviously other tunnels there that we could find, because there must be other entrances and exits to this place. It's totally enigmatic. And the main tunnel runs absolutely east-west. It's a feat of engineering, to say the least.
Right, and we actually we interviewed Robert Temple. He'll on his book Oracle of the Dead. We highly recommend it. I mean, truly an astounding work. And I wasn't aware of your friendship before that, but now I have a new admiration for it. And I think it's just absolutely wonderful the way the two of you collaborated on this project.
I mean, Robert's been a good friend of mine for some years, and you know, we have a lot of dialogue on these subjects. And you know, I'd love to recommend his book. I can't recommend his book highly enough. It's brilliant.
Absolutely.
As are all his books, I have to say.
Oh, truly phenomenal intellect. I mean, we're so fortunate to have him as writing, and as well as you. And on that subject, I mean, you're probably still looking for a breather from all of the recent publicity and all of that. And once again, we truly appreciate you taking time to talk with us. What might be next for Michael Baigent?
Well, I'm off. I've got a massive research which I'm trying to structure and find a way through, and allow me to know where I need to continue my research. I'm working on a new book which hopefully will be out next year, but I've with all this distraction of the court case against the Da Vinci Code, I've sort of lost about 6 months as a result of that, and I'm just now getting back into my own writing rhythm again. So hopefully it won't be too long before I'm back on track and working on a new book. But,
by the way, one of my favorites was The Elixir and the Stone. Maybe you'll go back into some of those areas again?
Oh, you know, I'm really glad to hear you say that. That book is one.
Thanks, Whitley. And one of the surprises is this is not a story about Mount Ararat, Turkey. This is about a mountain in northern Iran that once upon a time biblically was referred to as the Kingdom of Ararat, long before the time of Jesus Christ. The Bible says God was angry at sinful humanity and planned to flood the planet above all the mountaintops to get rid of everyone. But God took pity on a man named Noah and his family and decided to save them and many animals. The salvation, according to the Bible, was a boat made of gopher wood. As the floodwaters receded, Noah's Ark came to rest on, quote, Ararat Mountains, unquote, plural. In Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 27, Ararat is called a kingdom that fights with Babylon, not a volcanic mountain in Turkey. In fact, Mount Ararat, Turkey, was not given that name until around 1200 AD. That means historically there was an ancient Ararat kingdom with many mountains in what most likely would have been Mesopotamia or today's Iran and Iraq. Further, the King James Version of the Bible in chapter 11, verse 2, states that Noah's descendants, quote, journeyed from the east and found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there, unquote. 3 chapters later, in Genesis chapter 14, Shinar is the land ruled by King Amraphel, who reigned in Babylon. Babylon means gate of God and was in the plain of Shinar on the Euphrates River, about 50 miles south of modern-day Baghdad, Iraq. One Noah's Ark researcher named Robert Cornuke had explored Mount Ararat in Turkey with astronaut James Irwin some years ago. Mr. Cornuke was FBI trained and worked as a police investigator and SWAT team member in Orange County, California. He read a lot of history, and as a hard-nosed investigator, he came to the conclusion that Noah's Ark...
So it's very exciting to see this object up there that was very different than all the other rocks in the whole region.
Could you give me some sizes? The Bible talked in cubits. No one today really understands exactly what a cubit is.
Right. Well, the Bible describes the ark as being 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. Now, a cubit is a fluctuating distance. It was the tip of the finger to the elbow of the ruler at the time. Now, that's where the problem comes in. We don't know how big the ruler was at the time. But a loose interpretation is about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. An enormous ship. So we found this object to be about 400 feet long in the side of a hill. It goes in one side and outside the other. So this object just fits the general description of the Bible.
Is there some scientific method that can now be applied to this rock that could confirm if it was wood originally and when it may have been constructed as wood?
Well, yes and no. We don't even know what gopher wood is. So not knowing what gopher wood was at the time the ark was constructed, we just don't have a method to determine what gopher wood is. At the best, we can look at some of these rocks and slice them open in thin sections and see if we can see any cell structure. When we cut these rocks open, we found a unique sea organism in it, which was in the rock, which can only be found in a deep ocean environment. We also found sea life around this object, which indicated to us that at one time it was under the ocean. We found literally thousands of clams, some of them a 1-inch thick mantle of clams in the area at about 14,000 feet. Now, this object had some cell structure within it, but maybe the whole object is stone and just a few of the samples down below had some cell structure, which would be residue from petrified wood, maybe from trees that were up there involved. We're still going through the process of trying to determine what are we looking at this object. We've only been back a few weeks, and we're really in the embryonic stages of the research.
And when you say cell structure, you mean something that would be like from a tree or a plant that would be fossilized?
It looks as if some of the object that we brought back, some of the samples that we brought back, have some cell structure in them. Of course,
must have stopped on one of the Ararat mountains east of Babylon. He and others interested in finding the Ark's remains and other Bible artifacts formed the Bible Archaeology Search and Exploration Institute, known as BASE, B-A-S-E. In July 2005, a year ago, and this year in June, Mr. Cornuke and his team applied to the Iranian government for tourist visas, which were granted. Without publicity, the BASE team quietly searched a 15,000-foot-high mountain called Suleiman in the Elburz mountain range of northern Iran. There they found a large, dark-colored rock outcrop about 400 feet long that looks quite different than the surrounding mountain. On close inspection, the dark rock has a lot of slabs in it that could be interpreted as fossilized wood planks or beams of a boat. And you can see very good photographs of this most recent expedition at my news website, earthfiles.com. At the top of the headlines page is a hot link to this Noah's Ark report. Now, what convinced Bob Cornuke to search the Iranian mountain?
We were told early on by a man named Ed Davis in 1943, who was an Army sergeant building roads through Iran, that he was taken up to this mountain and shown this object that he was told to be Noah's Ark. So going to this one particular mountain, that's what we were doing, is following the Ed Davis story, this sergeant in World War II. I went to the University of Denver. Ed Davis had provided me with a map to get up to the site. We followed the map. He told me how we could get to this site, the roads to use, and we found the site that Ed Davis said he saw Noah's Ark. It wasn't that impressive when we first walked up to it. We said, well, this is just a big black rock outcropping, very different from anything else for miles and miles and miles. Very distinctive rock outcropping. When we got up close to it, we saw that the rocks resembled beams, a stone that was now looking like wooden beams. It looked like they had been on a ship at one time, or some wooden. Most of the objects up there just looked like rock, just common everyday rock. But we took the most tantalizing pieces that might have some cell structure, and we're really pleased that we have found a little, or we're told that we have little.
Robert Cornuke's next goal is to pay for clear close-up satellite imagery of this dark rock outcropping on Mount Suleiman in the Elburz Mountains. The fact that the unusual long slabs of rock stick out both sides of the mountaintop does not prove it's a fossilized ark. But at least Mr. Cornuke thinks he is finally looking on the right mountain range east of Baghdad in the mountains of northern Iran, not Turkey. Another Earth mystery has been unfolding amid all of the Earth mounds in the southwestern Indiana area. If you find Evansville, Indiana on a map, a little southeast of the city is the Angel Mound Historic Site, those strange, mysterious, multiple mounds all over the Midwest. And here is one of those areas. Several miles northeast of Angel Mounds in Dubois County is the farming community of Huntingburg. On Sunday, June 25th, wheat farmer David Ring was running his harvester into his last field. Suddenly, he realized that there was a big flat circle neatly laid down in his crop. He told me that the plants looked combed down in a swirl. And he said one of his farmhands and he got off the harvester, they walked around and they discovered that there were also odd patterns coming off of the big circle. One looked like a backward F, and the other was a straight line with two short lines coming off of it. And there were also two big loops coming off one side of the circle that looked a bit like their own tractor tram lines. The lines were not perfect. They ranged from being 1.5 to nearly 3 feet wide, but Mr. Ring knew that he and his tractor and harvester had not made those loops. Mr. Ring was puzzled, but he told me, quote, "It was my last field. I'm a farmer, and I wanted to get this."
And Turkey, and it's quite amazing. Then she's going to be talking about some events in a crop circle here in the United States that are shockingly similar to something that happened to me in a similar circle here in this country. So it's very, very unusual and exciting stuff. Then we have an extraordinarily special show for you. Michael Baigent is with us. The Jesus Papers, his new book exposing an incredible cover-up, answering the questions about Christianity that he has been asking ever since Holy Blood, Holy Grail. He and William Henry get into this deeply, and it is really amazing. Then William and Jordan Maxwell, for our subscribers, talk about this and many, many other things. You will get a whole new view and a whole new look at the remarkable life of a remarkable being, Jesus Christ, listening to this show. Next week on Dreamland, Hakim is going to be with us. Hakim is a teacher in the ancient Kemet tradition from ancient Egypt. His family has kept the teachings of the ancient Egyptian priesthood intact all of these years, and he's got some extraordinary things to say. He's the teacher of William Henry. He's the teacher of Stephen Mailer. He is a truly remarkable man, so get set for some real wonder in your life next week on Dreamland. And isn't that what we're really all about here, is looking up and seeing the wonder all around us. Before we go on, I'd like to let you subscribers know that in August you will be getting a signed bookplate in the mail for the Greys, a special Greys bookplate personally signed by me. You do not need to buy a copy. You'll get it simply because you are a subscriber. So if you reserve a copy at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or your local bookstore, you buy a copy of the Greys, know that you will get a signature. The reason I'm doing this is I'm not doing a very extensive author tour for the Greys at all because of various conditions. It's extremely difficult to do these days. So I'm going to be sending everyone a signed bookplate instead. And now from earthfiles.com, the best edge science website in the world, here's Linda Moulton Howe.